Pastor Lynette. What a great reminder. That's another thing to add to the list of things for which you are thankful. Amen. God's faithfulness to us. Whenever you think about Thanksgiving, a lot of things come to our mind, many of which, of course, are spiritual in nature. Things related to God and His benevolence, to His many, many rich blessings, and of course, His greatest gift to all, which is found in the person of Jesus Christ. And so certainly there are many spiritual things we think about during the Thanksgiving season. There are also other things that are not spiritual so much, but more secular in nature, things not related so much to religion or spirituality, but still we think about and celebrate things like, turkey, pumpkin pie, football, and then you get into the historical aspect of it, and you think about the Indians and the Pilgrims and the Mayflower and all these different images that come to our mind with Thanksgiving. Well, today we're going to talk about pilgrims. And I'm not going to give you a history lesson so much, but I want to point to the fact that there are two places in the Bible, only two, but there are two, that refer to us, God's people, as pilgrims. There are two places. One is in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, and the other one is in 1 Peter, chapter 2. We're going to look at these verses to see what the Bible says about us in our journey on earth, what it has to do with us being pilgrims. Why did these writers use that particular word in describing us? And so in Hebrews 11, remember the writers talking about the great heroes of the faith who had gone before, who had given their lives in sacrifice for the kingdom. And he says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Then the other is in 1 Peter 2 and verse 11, where Peter says, Beloved, I beg you, as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. Now you're probably familiar with the fact that the Bible uses different metaphors and images to refer to us, God's people. For example, we're all familiar with the idea of being God's sheep. And Jesus is the shepherd, and we are His sheep. The Bible also uses images and words related to the family, that we are God's children, that we in the Christian faith are brothers and sisters, that God is our Father, that He's adopted us into His family. And we talk about these images and metaphors quite often. But there's another category that God uses in the Scriptures to refer to His people that we're going to look at today. God calls us foreigners, aliens, strangers, sojourners, and pilgrims. Admittedly, we don't talk about this category nearly as often as we talk about the others I've mentioned. Many times we talk about our being God's sheep and His pasture. Many times we talk about being brothers and sisters in the kingdom. But very seldom do we talk about this idea of our being strangers and foreigners in this world, pilgrims on the earth. And I think it's very important, particularly during this Thanksgiving week, to talk about this idea of pilgrims and what it has to do with our Christian journey. Why did they use these words in referring to us? Well, when you look at the New Testament and the words that are used, translated from the original language to pilgrims, a good working definition of a pilgrim in this context is this: that a pilgrim is a traveler in a strange place away from home. A pilgrim is a sojourner or a traveler in a strange place away from home. And when you look at that definition and you think about our walk in this world as Christians, it becomes apparent as to why the New Testament writers, even though it was only these two, referred to us as pilgrims. And so we're going to look at some characteristics of our lives as pilgrims to really help us understand more our role in this world and why God used these particular ideas. So the first thing I want to mention is this, that pilgrims live amid fleeting surroundings. You see, pilgrims are on a journey. They realize that where they are, they're just a-passin through. In the bulletin, I don't know if you noticed that I use that as my title today for this message, that we're just a-passin through. We don't hear that phrase that much anymore, do we? In the past, you used to hear it more in the church. There have been some songs written with that title, that we're just a-passin through. I know that you grammar geeks might begin to tremor a little bit when you hear that word a-passin, because it's not technically a word, but you know, in the church, we use it still sometimes, that we're just passing through, that this is not our home, that we're on our way to our heavenly home. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but for now, as we're passing through this world, it helps us to remember that the things around us are fleeting, that we're only here for a short time. And so we ought not hold too tightly to the things around us, that we need to hold loosely to the things of this earth, because we're just a-passin through. And so as you look at these two verses that we've read, the one in Hebrews 11 and the one in 1 Peter chapter 2, there are a couple of things I want to mention specifically that we need to remember that aren't going to last forever. The first one mentioned by Peter is the pleasures of the world. The pleasures of the world are not there forever. Peter says, I beg you, as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. And so Peter is pointing out the fact that all the pleasures of the world aren't lasting. They're not eternal. They're just passing. And Peter's saying, stay away from those things that can destroy your soul. Now, certainly God has given us some good things to enjoy. The Bible even says that He's given us all things richly to enjoy. And He's given us some legitimate things that bring us satisfaction and pleasure in life. God's not a killjoy. He's given us many things that enable us to enjoy life. But what Peter's talking about here are those things that are not godly, those things that are worldly, those things that can destroy us. And he says, don't give yourself to these things. They're just passing. And they ultimately can destroy your soul. He said that they war against the soul. I want to use an example of something that used to be a common sight in cities across America, and that is a circus, and particularly the Midway. Now, some of you young people, you only read about circuses in the history books now, but they used to be a common sight. And I want to particularly talk about the Midway. Someone wrote this in connection with this, and it kind of illustrates the passing pleasures, the nature of fleeting pleasures. This individual wrote this way: remember when circuses were in their heyday? One of the biggest events in town would be the circus. And once the circus was set up, great attractions were lined up along the Midway. The Midway was the walk leading to the big tent. There, vendors hawked their merchandise. Happy music played. The smell of hot dogs and cotton candy mingled in the air. Amusement park rides were on either side. The Midway was almost more than a little boy could handle. As Joe walked with his father down the circus Midway, the most intriguing sights to him were the sideshows. Posters would advertise a man with 3 eyes, or a bearded lady, a sword swallower, fire eaters. And the barker in front added to the intrigue with vivid descriptions of all that waited behind these compelling posters. For 2 bits, you can come in and see the most amazing wonders in the world. I would pull my dad's hand and beg him to take me in so I could see for myself. Joe, he would say, it's a waste of money. It's not all it's cracked up to be. So I grew up longing to see what was behind those posters, to experience what my dad said was so wasteful and not worthwhile. So when I grew up and I had my own money, I paid a few dollars and went in. But to my dismay, My father was right. I had wasted my money. It wasn't all they had said it was. And I found myself feeling betrayed. He goes on to say that the world around us is a lot like that midway. We navigate through this world in which we live, and there are people on our right and people on our left who are crying out to us, offering us all kinds of promises and pleasures related to money and sex and power and popularity, fame, drugs, alcohol, on it goes. And these people cry out and promise so much. Sometimes it's the advertising, sometimes it's the signs, sometimes it's people, sometimes it's our friends. And what's worse is it's not like the midway at the circus where it just takes up your money and maybe consumes a little bit of your time. The problem with these things out in the real world is that it can destroy your very soul and even damn you to hell. So don't take lightly these that are crying out to the right and to the left to get us off the straight and narrow, to give in to these worldly passions, these fleshly lusts, as Peter calls them. Because as pilgrims, we need to realize we're just a passing through. And these things that are crying out to us can take our souls and just rip it apart and destroy our relationship with Jesus. We need to realize that our eyes are on a bigger goal. And all these pleasures the world has to offer never satisfy. So certainly the pleasures of life Peter talks about, and as pilgrims we need to be focused. It's interesting, I think, that he says, as sojourners and pilgrims abstain from fleshly lust, because what Peter's saying is you got to realize that this world isn't our home. We're going to talk about that in a minute too. I got a lot that I'm promising before our meal, But we're going to talk about these things. But another thing that Peter says, and the writer of Hebrews mentions, that is something that we need to keep in mind. It's just passing, and this is a good one. It's our problems. It's our problems. You know our problems aren't eternal. Now I know that there are some that you might be sitting there thinking, well, there are some problems in my life that I'm going to have with me forever. I'm not talking about your spouses, okay? I'm just talking, don't get me wrong. But I mean, some of you maybe have some physical issues that you deal with, or things that relate to your personal life, maybe some things related to your family, and you think, I got a certain condition, I'm going to have the rest of my life. But what I'm talking about is even when we leave this world, our problems we leave behind. And knowing that hope ought to encourage us. I know living in this life, if you've got something you're dealing with on a constant basis regularly for day after day, I know it can be very debilitating and very disheartening. But I'll think about in Hebrews 11, when the writer is talking about us as pilgrims, and he says, these who all died in faith, they didn't experience the promise, but they saw it afar off. And they embraced it. And they saw that they were just sojourners and pilgrims in this world. You see, what the writer of Hebrews is saying is, sure, they had problems. In fact, their problems cost them their very lives. But because they had this hope in them of heaven, this promise, they embraced it, and it helped them to endure the problems that they suffered through. The pilgrims, when they were here in America, suffered many great problems. Half of their number died because of the fierce elements that they faced. The weather and disease and all of that. But those who were left continued to persevere because they had their hope on a brighter dream. And that's what motivated them. And so when our problems mount, it helps us to remember our problems aren't forever. They're not eternal. We can leave them behind when this world comes to an end. And sure, it might be a little while that we deal with them now. But that's why Paul said in 2 Corinthians 4, it's a great verse when you're going through sorrow and suffering. 2 Corinthians 4, 17 and 18. Paul said, for our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. I read about this one guy who had an interesting way of looking at his problems. He was in the military, and they were going through all the training for jumping out of an airplane. And they said that when you jump out of an airplane, with a parachute, by the way, didn't mention that, did I? Count to 10, and pull the ripcord. Then they said, if your parachute doesn't open, don't you love that statement? If your parachute doesn't open, pull the second ripcord and your auxiliary chute will open. Then they said there will be a truck on the ground waiting for us to take us back to camp, back to base. And so the guy's up in the plane a few days later, get ready for his first jump, and he holds his breath and he jumps and he does what they say to do. He counts to 10 and he pulls the ripcord, and nothing happened. So he pulls the second ripcord, and nothing happened. So here he is plummeting toward the earth at this great rate of speed, and he thinks to himself, now that's just great. Now I bet that truck's not going to be down there either. Now this guy had an interesting way of looking at his problems. Maybe not the healthiest way, maybe not the best way, but he knew his problems weren't going to last forever. And that's how it needs to be for all of us. We need to realize that as we go through suffering and sorrow in this world, as debilitating as it can be, as discouraging as it can be, think about the hope that we have in Jesus. I have known people who have suffered their entire lives with some debilitating illnesses, some distressing family dynamics, and yet they've served Jesus faithfully. They've been loyal to him. They've maintained their joy. And I am convinced that the only way they were able to do that is because they had their eyes firmly fixed on the fact that Jesus was their hope, and that they had a brighter hope in heaven, and that when this world came to an end, when their lives on earth came to an end, they could lay all their problems aside. The second thing about living life as a pilgrim is that pilgrims live in a foreign place. You know, when pilgrims travel, they travel to a foreign place. And this certainly describes all of us as Christians living in this world as believers in the Lord Jesus Christ. We're living in a foreign place. Even if you were born in America and you've lived your entire life in America and you've never stepped outside of the United States, did you know that you're a foreigner? That you're an alien? Not an alien as an outer space alien, but alien as in a traveler in another country. You're a foreigner. Paul says that we're strangers and foreigners in the land. Pilgrims are people who live in a foreign place. Our home is in heaven, and we're only here for a short time. This is not our home, and so we're foreigners here. Let me ask you this. Have you ever felt out of place in this world as a Christian? I would imagine that we all have. It's kind of like when you go to another country. You know, the customs are different, the culture is different. They speak a different language, most likely. The ways of doing things are different. Everything just can sometimes seem weird. You know, kind of like when you go to Arkansas. It can be that way. But you know, you go to even Canada, which is very much like America. I mean, their gasoline, you know, they have the metric system, so it's posted in liters, you know, the cost per liter, and you got to figure all that out. And if you go to a country that's very different from ours, you have to learn their customs and their cultures and how it's very easy to feel out of place when you travel to a foreign country. Well, as Christians in this world, it's very common for us to feel out of place. In fact, I would say this, if you don't feel uncomfortable at times, or at least a little bit out of place as you walk with Jesus, if you don't feel somewhat out of place in this world, then maybe you need to check your values and the things that guide you in life, because we as Christians have a very different value system than this world in which we live. I mean, look at the decisions that are often made by our government. Think about the political atmosphere. Okay, don't think about it. You'll be better off that way. You know, the entertainment industry. I mean, even the way advertising works. You know, the values of this world and all that they have. Isn't it easy to look at all this and say, this is not how I think? The decisions that they're making and the values that even maybe our neighbors hold are not like the ones I have. Now, you could just be out with your friends, maybe some who aren't Christians, and come to realize very quickly. I mean, you fit in terms of your personality and all that, But you may see very quickly how their values are different than yours. And you think, yeah, it's okay. I like my friends and all, but it's just not the same. I don't belong in this world. And there's a lot of truth in that. We're not of this world. In Philippians chapter 3, Paul said our citizenship is in heaven, from whence we also look for our Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. That's our home. And so again, we're just a passing through. And the Bible says that all the world lies under the power of the evil one, 1 John chapter 5. And so it shouldn't come as any surprise that we as Christians maybe at times feel a little uncomfortable, certainly a little out of place in this world because of the values that we see promoted in this world. But there is one thing that God has given to us to help us make it through when we feel so out of place or uncomfortable in this world. And that one place is the church. We see an example of this in our society in that in most countries of the world, America has an embassy. In fact, when we were in the Philippines, Cindy and I, we went by the American embassy a number of times because it's on a main road there, 1201 Roxas Boulevard in Manila. And our hosts pointed out that's the American embassy right there, And in all kinds of countries, in Egypt and in Japan and South Korea. Not sure about North Korea. Have to look into that one. But we have an embassy, And think about what an embassy is. One person described it as a little spot of America in a foreign land. Now consider this. In the embassy, there are pictures of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln. The American flag is flown in all its glory. They celebrate Thanksgiving in that embassy, even if it's in Egypt, even if it's in Australia, even if it's in Afghanistan. They celebrate Thanksgiving on the fourth Thursday of November, just like we do. When July 4th rolls around, Independence Day, they celebrate it in the embassy because it's Independence Day for America. Now, they're not in America, but they're in the embassy. Now, if you venture outside the embassy into that foreign land, it's going to be very different. It might be very hostile to your American values. You won't feel comfortable many times. You may feel out of place. But as long as you're in the embassy, you see it's a little spot of America in a foreign country. The church is that and so much more. It's a little spot of heaven right here on earth. Now, we walk outside these doors and we go out into the world, we may face some hostility. We'll certainly come across many people who don't share our values. But as long as we're with the church, it's a little spot of America, or a little spot of heaven, right here on earth, that God has given to us to enjoy as we go through this foreign land. Because after all, we are just a passing through. One other piece that I want to share about pilgrims that relates to us is that pilgrims are going to a future possession. Pilgrims, as they travel, always have a future in mind. They're not just traveling for the sake of traveling. They have a future possession in mind. And certainly that is true with us. In Hebrews 13:14, the writer said, "Here we have no continuing city, but we seek one to come." That's our heavenly home. Again, in Hebrews 11, when he talked about pilgrims, he talked about how they saw the promise afar off, and they embraced it. It was that future possession that enabled Isaiah and Jeremiah and so many of the others, prophets and apostles, to suffer the persecution they did, because it was that future hope that encouraged them and inspired them on. One person said that a lot of people think that we're in the land of the living, going to the land of the dying, when in reality, we're in the land of the dying, going to the land of the living. Isn't that right? We're going to the land of the living. We're going to heaven. And that's where our focus needs to be. You see, it's that mindset of heaven that not only keeps us grounded, but keeps us focused as we walk in this world. In Colossians 3 and verse 1, Paul said, set your affections or your mind on things above, not on things on the earth. And I think right here is a key component in helping us live the Christian life the way God wants us to. Now, I know you can be so heavenly minded that you're no earthly good. You've heard that expression before, but the Bible certainly indicates, doesn't it, that we need to be heavenly minded. And I really believe that the more we keep our minds on heaven and have an eternity focus, then the wiser decisions we'll make here. Because we realize how transient this life is. We realize how great God is. We realize what's really important. What ought to be valued are the things of eternity rather than the passing pleasures and pursuits of this world. I read a great book a number of years ago. It's one of my favorites by a guy named Joseph Stoll. Joe Stoll was the president of Moody Bible Institute for a while. And he wrote a book called Eternity. And he talked about earthbound Christians. He talked about Christians who keep their mind just focused on the things of the world, the things of earth, rather than the things of God. Because the book is primarily about being eternity focused, keeping our mind on things of heaven, because that guides us in making wise decisions here. But he says too many people are earthbound Christians, meaning they focus too much on the things of earth. He said their expectations, their plans, their dreams, their goals, their schemes center around the things of earth. And as a result of that, money and passions that are often ungodly, immorality, and these things just monopolize their lives and their pursuits. And then the last thing he mentioned along these lines was this, that people who focus more on the things of earth rather than the things of eternity are more likely to be taken in by greed, by immoral passions, by power, giving themselves to fame and popularity, which can often be empty, sacrificing the things that are important for the things that are passing. And so he argued in that book how important it is to keep our minds focused on the things above. Colossians 3:1 again, set your affection on things above, not on things on the earth, for your life is hid with Christ in God. And that's why he says we need to do just that. But if we focus too much on the things of earth, then we start seeing the things around us as the most important things. And they're so outside of God's will and so disappointing that they can destroy the soul. See, we're just kind of like citizens in transit. Think of it that way. We're just a passing through. And we need to be thinking about home. I heard a story, a true story about this one sailor. He was up in Albany, New York one time. And somebody asked him what time it was. And he looked at his watch. He said it was 7:20 p.m. Well, the guy who asked him knew it was later than that, even though he didn't know exactly what time it was. He knew it was later than 7:20. And so he said to the guy, he said, your watch must have stopped. And the sailor said, no, it hasn't stopped. He said, you see, I'm from Utah. Now remember, Albany, New York's in the Eastern time zone. Utah's in Mountain time, 2-hour difference. And he said, when I left home to go into the military, my dad gave me this watch to help me to remember my family and home. And so he said, I keep it set on Mountain time. And that way, when I look at my watch and it says that it's 5 o'clock in the morning, I know my dad's crawling out of bed and going out to milk the cows. And when I look at my watch and it says 6 p.m., I know my family's gathered around the dinner table, getting ready to eat, and they're thanking God for all of his blessings. And he said, it keeps my mind focused on home, to remember why I'm doing this, to remember how much they love me, and to keep me going when the going gets tough. He said, I can figure out what time it is locally easy enough. He said, but I want to know what's going on back home. I want to think about home. If we as Christians would change our mindset, and instead of getting drawn in so easily to the things around us, we so easily get fooled into thinking that everything we hear in advertising, everything we hear in the media, everything we read about, online or everything we hear about. We think in all these things of the world, all these flashy things on the midway. We think that's really where it's at. And all we're doing is just throwing our money away, throwing our time away, and potentially throwing our souls away. And we need to keep our minds focused on the things of heaven. Because, friend, listen, as Christians, we really are just a passing through. So let's keep our minds on heaven, our eternal home. Let's stand together as we pray. Lord Jesus,